Hello, digital educator, and welcome to this session that is an introduction to the New York State Computer Science and Digital Fluency Standards. This is a quick session that should get you up to speed on just the framework and the overview of how the standards work. After this point, you'll have to go into subsequent sessions to be able to look at the standards, to look at the progressions, to look at where you stand with regard to the standards of your grade band, what came before that, what went after that. But let's give this broad overview first to tell about how these standards work. And so for this session, we have some objectives. By the end, I hope that you are going to be able to, and you should be able to, one, state the rollout timelines for the standards. When should all of this work be done by? What are we looking towards for the rollout? Next, we have to identify the principles used in creating the standards. When they were created, what were the thoughts, what was the process of thought behind creating these standards? Next, when these standards went into the review phase, what lenses were used to look at the standards to make sure that they were appropriate? Next, you should be able to read the standard naming convention. It's pretty quite easy. So this one will come very, very quickly to you. And then you should be able to identify the concept areas of the standards, the groupings of the standards. And there's one more thing I'd like to add on here too that's not put onto here, but it is important. I hope that you walk away with how the progressions work, how the coherence of the standards work. That way you can understand about that roadmap like I talked about, what came before your standards, where are your standards, where you're leading to, and what's the big objective in the end that we hope to get kids to. Now, when setting out to create these standards, the work group had to create a vision. Why are we creating standards? What do we need standards for? And so this work group created, along with New York State Ed Department, this vision that every student will know how to live productively and safely in a technology-dominated world. This includes understanding the essential features of digital technologies, why and how they work, and how to communicate and create using those technologies. And so one of the things I want to point out here is notice that it doesn't say every kid's going to be doing coding. We're going to do 3D printing. We're going to teach kids about how to do network maintenance or how to build their own computer. No, the big picture of what this work group set out in creating these standards is for life. That when kids graduate, not only we're going into the careers and having the skills prepared for the careers ahead of them, but to be able to leverage educational technology and technology itself through the process of learning. And once we get beyond the four walls of our schools, how can we use technology to make our lives better? So it's not about the here and the now and the tech and the nitty gritty, the apps and the hardware. It's about the big picture, about using technology to make life better, and how do we prepare kids for that outside of the four walls of our schools. So this big picture again as well too that has to really permeate through is that we often think about tech ed as something that's done by someone else. Especially if you're an elementary teacher, you think, well, I'm a third grade teacher. I shouldn't be teaching that stuff. It should be our library media specialist that's teaching about these digital standards, these computer science and digital fluency standards. And that's absolutely wrong. We need to think that we all play a part in how these standards and about how these understandings are conveyed to our kids. It goes beyond just the credit-bearing classes, and we have to think about how we're going to build digital citizens through everything we do from the day that they walk into our school until the day that they graduate. When we want to arrive at those end goals, what do we have to do every step along the way, and what are the roadmaps, the landmarks we need to get to that point? Now, a couple of years ago, there was a school district in our region, Colton-Pierpont, that was working on something kind of like this, and Beekman Town was as well. More of like a scope and a sequence about what are the high watermarks that we have to get to, when are kids going to be able to copy and to paste and to be able to select and highlight. So starting to build a scope and a sequence, but the way that we think about these standards instead, because that's more of like what do we do? Standards are larger overall thinking. The standards help to develop this foundation at a young age to understand the concepts that come later on. So standards then go into your scope and your sequence, and then your scope and your sequence drives your curricula and the skills of what it's going to be. So it's kind of like two steps ahead of that, of what those districts are trying to work towards, a broader picture a less discrete picture than what was working towards. But nonetheless, it helps to get all of us as schools in New York State to get on the same page when it comes to having a consistent expectation of what kids are going to be able to know and going to be able to do when it comes to digital citizenship, when it comes to computer science and digital fluency. So here's a review of how these standards came to be. Back in October of 2018 into the March of 2019. So basically one winter, you had what's called a work group. This work group went through and they created a first draft of the standards of what they thought we needed. And then April came along and this work group reviewed the work that they'd done. They revised, they looked at each other's work and created all of these suggestions that are based upon the initial first draft of the standards. It got sent off to what's called the review group. And the review group used these lenses. It's particular areas of focus to review the work that had been done to make sure that these lenses were portraying the standards in a light that makes sure that what we're needing to focus upon is focused upon and it's conveyed accurately. So in the summer of 2019, July and August, State Ed and a reputable computer science education consultant revised. They took all of these suggestions from the work group in their review, in the review group in all of their review, and put them into one coherent set of standards based upon all that feedback that was provided. Then finally, January 2020, the Board of Regents had these initially compiled standards placed before them. They had provided an initial approval of the standards, but at the same point they said, a lot of this stuff with kindergarten that comes into here in that first grade band, kindergarten, first grade, it impacts our young students, and so we want to make sure that this is developmentally appropriate, and it was sent off to the early learning review committee to make sure if there was any changes that needed to happen, that they were going to happen. After that point, COVID hit and took almost a whole year for these standards to come to fruition in their final form. So December 2020, these revised computer science and digital fluency standards were adopted by the New York State Board of Regents. So what timeline do we need to get everything rolled out by? There is a very, very short runway when it comes to awareness building. Usually this is a whole year, but we don't have that luxury when it comes to these standards. It's going to need more time when it comes to how are we going to implement the standards than, hey, we have these standards. So the first phase, it's called building awareness. It starts letting people know that we have new standards and that, hey, get ready because you're going to need to put these into play and start building a timeline for when these will be put into play. Starting in the 21-22 and following through the 22-23 academic year, there is a stage called capacity building. Now, what you're doing right now, the professional development and learning about these standards, it is only one part of that capacity building. Is it an important part? Absolutely. And yes, the educators that are going to be implementing these standards need to have professional development when it comes to the standards. But it goes so much more beyond that, because if you look at the next step, year one implementation, that's when we hit the ground running. There's a lot that needs to happen between knowing about the standards and then implementing them. So with this capacity building, that's why it's 2 years, you have to learn about the standards, and then you have to start gathering resources, developing plans, setting your scope and sequence in a local level to figure out how we're going to do these things. If we need to purchase things to be able to roll out these standards, what does it need to be? Purchasing can take a long time, especially if you're waiting for funds in an area that's depleted for the year. So that capacity building will close out August 2023, because in the 23-24 academic year is the first year of implementation. This allows schools the staggered approach to roll everything out instead of just all in one fell swoop. So all credit-bearing computer science courses will be aligned with the New York State computer science and digital fluency standards. So starting at the top and then working backwards, because in the next year, 24-25, starting in September 2024, all of the standards should be put into play by K-12 by that year. So when they were creating these standards, there were some few principles that really guided how they wanted these standards to be set up. And the first had to do with equity and access. So individuals with disabilities need to be able to access these. And the equity part, realizing the fact that culture plays a very real role in how individuals learn and what supports they need in order to arrive at learning. And so realizing that there's these diversity and needs that we need to pay attention to. Next is interdisciplinary connections. Tech ed should not just be the computer lab. It should just not be this one spot that's over by itself. Technology should permeate the whole educational experience because there's so much that it offers to students, to teachers, that it can't just be the AV room anymore or the computer lab. How we're going to use technology across all of the subject areas. Next is coherence, and this is probably my favorite part about the standards, in that there is very much an orderly progression about how we're going to get each step of the way to end up at our end design. It was just like backwards design, in that we started with where we wanted our high school seniors to be in those credit-bearing courses, and then we worked backwards. How we're going to get there from kindergartners to being seniors in high school, being able to do these things. And that comes through coherence, having a very logical, orderly manner that we go about tackling these big, audacious standards. And then finally, relevance and engagement. Relevance means that kids find these educational standards, that they find the educational practices and the materials to relate to their world around them. And finally, engagement. Learning is an active process, and we learn things by doing things, especially with technology, and to be able to fail forward, to blaze away, to learn that kids have to be able to touch things, to move things, to play around in order for them to be engaged and to learn. So those are the principles. Next, again, after they did the initial creating of the standards using the guiding principles, they went through with these lenses to make sure the fact that what we need to focus upon is actually focused upon and that it is important to the standards that are created. Clarity and focus. We want to make sure that they are not spread so far that it's a lot to take on, and at the same point making sure they're easy to understand. No errors, no typographical errors, no syntax errors. Coherence and progressions, I talked about that one, and that's just the step how one standard leads into another. When we get to that slide, you'll see how beautiful they go, one to the next. Next, equity. Again, this is I talked about, that culture plays a real role in how individuals learn, and we need to take that into account and be mindful of the role that culture plays in learning. Next, interdisciplinary connections. Again, technology should not just be a one-room thing or a subject thing. It needs to permeate all the subject areas. Rigor. This is an interesting word that came out about 10 years ago. Well, it was out before that, but I mean, it became in vogue when the Common Core standards came out. Rigor does not just necessarily mean more difficult. Rigor means that we're getting to higher order thinking skills. Now, it's not a multi-step math problem, and it's really difficult to do. It's analysis, it's evaluation, it's synthesis. It's those things where they often don't have a correct answer that make it more intriguing, that make the learner think differently, as opposed to our finite knowledge of knowing and applying and the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So rigor, getting up to the higher level Bloom's taxonomy, analysis, evaluation, and synthesis. Relevant and engagement, we talked about that. The standards and the curricula that arise out of that need to have kids feeling like it pertains to the world that's around them, and they need to be able to get their hands dirty in working with these standards. And finally, specificity or granularity is, are we conveying what we need to convey? Is there enough detail to tell about that? Is it the right amount, just that the three bears, the baby bear right in between, too much detail, not enough detail. Specificity, arriving at that point where we have enough to cover the topic, but not too much. This is how we go about reading the standards. So as you'll see that there are 3 parts. Each part is separated by a period. You first have the grade band, there are 5 of those. K1, 2, 3, 4 through 6 is one of the 2 largest grade bands. 7, 8, which is traditionally your middle schools. junior highs, and then 9 to 12, your high schools. After that point, we have our 5 concept areas: impacts of computing, computational thinking, networks and system design, cybersecurity, and digital literacy. This tells what they are based upon a 2 or 3 letter shortening. And then finally, the standard number. As you will see with these standards, the grade band sets, and then you have the concept area, and then the standard number. For each of the concept areas, you're going to start over your standard number. And so as opposed to some of our other standards that go into smaller numbers, 1.1 or 1-2, this just goes along with the concept area. So again, here are our concepts of the standards: impacts of computing, computational thinking, networks and system design, cybersecurity, digital literacy. Impacts of computing, this is a whole broad understanding. This is more of like a societal review of how society has changed because of the use of technology, no matter what type of technology it was, either the lever, the wheel, or modern computing, Internet of Things. And talking about how it's created these different aspects of society and how society has changed as a result of technology. Now, once we have these concept areas, which is like a big umbrella, we then have sub-concepts that are running underneath these. They all have to do with impacts of computing, but they're much more specific. Inside of those sub-concept areas are where we find our standards. So we look at the impact of computing upon society, upon ethics, upon accessibility, and career paths. That's where we would find all of our IC standards. You'll notice that in the naming of the standards, you do not see the sub-concept areas. Those are to help guide you when you're reviewing the standards in full. Next concept area is computational thinking, which is where you would say the larger thought of being able to do coding, to be able to do computer-based thinking. It's about creating solutions for problems, and it's about how do we use technology in order to solve those problems. Sub-concepts are modeling and simulation, which could be CAD type stuff, data analysis and visualization, abstraction and decomposition, algorithms and processing. So all of these standards have to do with that and arriving at the ability to use computational thinking to create solutions for varied and vast numbers of problems. Third one is networks and system design. This is really your nitty-gritty hardware, software, internet group of standards. And so the networks and system design standards aim to prepare students to understand the basic function of computing systems and networks that were used as fundamental tools in our personal and professional lives. And as you see, the sub-concept areas are, in fact, hardware and software, and networks and the internet. Cybersecurity, which is ever important, is a concept area that has 3 sub-concepts underneath it. And this one stands for the cybersecurity standards prepare students to understand why data and computing resources need to be protected, who might access them, and why they might to do so, whether intentionally malicious or not. So underneath the cybersecurity, we find risks that come along with cybersecurity. Safeguards, what can we do to make sure the fact that we can be safe with our personal data? And finally, response, what can we do if our data is breached or if we have an account that is taken over? So standards that are working towards those end outcomes. Next, digital literacy. This is the ed tech as contrasted to the tech ed. Digital literacy refers to the ability to leverage computer technology to appropriately access digital information, to create, share, and modify artifacts, to interact and collaborate with others. With sub-concept areas there, digital use and digital citizenship. We need to explicitly teach kids how to behave when it comes to being online, when it comes to how we use these devices. Again, because we need to be able to use these devices to augment outcomes, to do things in education that we normally wouldn't be able to do. And so these set of standards help us to arrive at the ability to use ed tech, educational technology, to foster better outcomes for learning for kids. Back on to my favorite part about these standards, these progressions and the coherence between the progressions. You'll notice as we run horizontally here that this is a progression. We want to arrive here at this So I see that this is society, which means it's an impacts of computing concept area. And I can also see that through the IC. I can see this is grade 912, and that's the first standard. If we go down to the next one, we would see that would be 912 IC2. The end outcome that we want to arrive at for the impact of computing on society is to evaluate the impact of computing technologies on equity, access, influence in a global society. That is a huge, huge concept. And sometimes it can be a little bit tricky, so we have what are called clarifying statements or clarifying sentences underneath these standards. This clarifying statement says the focus should be on how computing technologies can both perpetuate inequalities and help to bring about equity in society. So it gives us a bit more information. Now, the great thing about these progressions, let's say, again, I'm a third grade teacher, I can see what it is that I should be working on. I should be able to identify and analyze how computing technology has changed the way people live and work. That's attainable. I can see what should have been done before they got to me. I can see where kids should be going to after that point, and I can see what the big goal is. So if I want to put my instruction into the right frame of mind of what we're trying to work towards, I can look towards the big end goal there. And so inside of the standards document, the PDF that is on the New York State Computer Science and Digital Fluency Standards website, which is a very lightweight, accessible, awesome site. You'll find a PDF on there with all of these, and you'll find all of these coherence progressions for the concepts and the sub-concepts to develop over the grade levels. It's a great package, a great tool. You should definitely go out there and check it out. And you will be in subsequent parts of this course. I put a bit.ly together so that you can go through and type out these, but as well, you can always just Google for NICED, Computer Science and Digital Fluency Standards, and the first result will literally be the site for these materials. With that, I hope that you have a more clear understanding about our new New York State Computer Science and Digital Fluency Standards, and that we can start digging in to see about how we can use these standards to enrich our educational technology and technology education instruction.